Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to slip through the damp corridors dimly lit by torches in the city of York during the 16th century, where every creaking floorboard could betray your soul, and every glance from a neighbor could turn into a death sentence. In the spring of 1586, Margaret Clitherow, a butcher's wife of considerable wealth, but with a faith stronger than any stone wall, was about to face a death so brutal it was reserved only for the most defiant. Picture this. Her body laid flat on the cold stone floor, a rough wooden door placed on her chest, and then heavy iron weights piled on top until her ribs shattered, and her final breath escaped as a broken whisper. You may feel brave sitting in your warm bed right now, but let's be honest, you wouldn't survive long in that moment. Before you settle in too comfortably, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly love what I'm doing here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Leave me a comment below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to create a soft wind-like background, and let's slowly step into tonight's journey. When you close your eyes, imagine the cobblestone streets of York veiled in a cold, misty haze. The sound of horse hooves fades into the distance, leaving behind a silence where fear and faith collide, like two quiet waves meeting in the dark. Margaret Clitherow was not born to be a symbol. She grew up in a Protestant family, married at 15 to John Clitherow, a well-to-do butcher, and might have spent her whole life surrounded by fresh meat and the bustle of market stalls. But one day, she began secretly attending Catholic masses where a small bell rang in hidden rooms and an ordinary wooden table turned into a sacred altar. For Margaret, that faith was more than ritual. It was the reason she turned her home into a sanctuary for priests who were being hunted like criminals. She hid them behind walls, under floorboards, in cramped spaces where a grown man had to curl his body tightly just to breathe. Every time a door shut quietly, she knew she was risking not just her life, but her entire family's. When Elizabeth's court decreed that holding mass or hiding priests was treason, Catholics like Margaret had to choose between silent submission or a life of resistance. And she chose resistance, quiet but unwavering. In her final months, Margaret's house became the heartbeat of the Catholic network in Yorkshire. Exhausted young priests, worn down by days of travel through snowy moors, were welcomed by her gentle gaze. They prayed together, exchanged news, and knew that once they crossed her threshold, they would be safe at least until morning. But then, on a cold March morning, Margaret realized no hidden door could protect them anymore. A child, questioned under pressure, revealed everything: the hidden room, the midnight masses, the priest in hiding. Just a few innocent words, and an entire web of faith collapsed in an instant. When the guards burst through the door, they found Margaret eating breakfast, calm as if it were any ordinary day. In that brief moment, she glanced at her small child, then at the officer in charge. Her eyes held no plea for mercy. They dragged her to York Castle. There, she was told to plead guilty and name names. But Margaret knew the law. If she confessed, the court would force her children to testify against their own mother. So she refused to say guilty or not guilty. That silence became her death sentence. There would be no defense, no leniency, only a cruel punishment known as pressing to death, peine forte et dure. A heavy wooden door laid across her chest, then stone after stone piled on, until her lungs could no longer rise for air. They asked her one final time, "Will you plead to save your life?" Margaret only shook her head. She would rather die in silence than let her words poison her children's conscience. As that final morning passed slowly, like a farewell whispered by time itself, it said, Margaret sat in her cell with hands clasped, eyes closed in prayer. In the damp stillness, the scent of stone and rust filled the air so thickly that even the guards didn't linger. You may think this was merely a tragic moment from a distant past, but imagine being a mother, fully aware that each passing second brought you closer to a death so brutal even the cruelest would hesitate. It is said that the night before her execution, Margaret wrote a few lines to her husband and children. Her handwriting was small and steady, like her final breath, without a tremble. In the letter, she said little about fear. She only asked John to care for the children, to let them grow up in the peace she could not preserve. Few people know that just before her sentence was carried out, Margaret asked for one small mercy: to be allowed to give birth before dying, but the court refused. They feared that giving her even a few more weeks would be seen as weakness or worse, compassion. Historians still debate this detail, Some insist she was pregnant, others say it was only a rumor to stir pity. Whatever the truth, the cruelty of her sentence remains unchanged. When you close your eyes again, try to hear the heavy iron door creaking open in your mind, the wind threading its way through stone walls, the measured footsteps. And in the midst of it all, a small woman stepping forward without hesitation. Perhaps she already knew that nothing could save her, except her own courage. When Margaret lay down on the stone floor, they placed a thick wooden board across her chest. She did not struggle. A witness later said her eyes closed, her lips still murmuring Latin prayers she had learned as a young girl hiding in the dark to attend Mass. In that moment, the boundary between fear and peace seemed to vanish. You might be thinking, if it were me, I would have screamed, compromised, found a way out. I used to think that too. But then there are people like Margaret, who choose silence, a silence louder than any defense. They placed the first stone on the board. The sound wasn't loud, just a dull thud that vanished into the stillness. Can you imagine it? Each stone a ticking countdown, a strange measure of faith. Someone later recorded that as the weight began to press down on her chest, Margaret still did not cry out. She only trembled slightly, then continued whispering her prayers. In her agony, it said she asked God to forgive all those who had condemned her. A rarely mentioned detail, she also prayed for Queen Elizabeth, the very woman who signed her death order asking God to open her heart to find the light. For then, it may seem strange to you, even as every bone in her body was being crushed, Margaret held on to something no one could take away: compassion. The final few minutes stretched on like eternity. Her breaths grew shallow, her lungs no longer able to rise under the weight. But just before complete silence, it's believed she whispered one final sentence. No one can say for sure what it was. Some say it was a prayer. Others say it was a mother softly calling the name of her child. And then, everything returned to silence. The cold stone chamber, the stacked stones forming a makeshift tomb. If you're listening to this story at night, notice the coolness drifting down your spine, the feeling of witnessing something both terrifying and beautiful. You see, a person's body can be crushed, but not what makes them immortal. When the final stone was placed, Margaret Clitherow became part of history. A symbol still whispered about, hundreds of years later, on quiet nights like this one. And if you ever wonder whether that kind of courage is real or just legend, remember, historians still haven't agreed on all the details. But sometimes, debate itself proves that a story has outgrown court records and become something more, a reminder that faith, even small, can echo in the dark. If you've ever wondered why a powerful court would be afraid of a few priests in black robes, remember that England had just emerged from decades of religious chaos. Just a generation before, King Henry VIII had decided to break from the Roman Church, a decision that shattered not only the Church, but society itself. Catholics who still recognized the Pope's authority were seen as potential traitors. The central historical spark that lit this hunt was the Act of Supremacy in 1534. Once Henry VIII named himself supreme head of the Church of England, loyalty to Rome became a political crime, no longer a personal choice of worship. By Elizabeth I's reign, the tension had reached a fever pitch. The court believed any priest trained on the continent could be a spy, and strangely enough, Elizabeth's government began offering generous cash rewards to anyone who reported a priest. In other words, hunting clergy became a fairly common side job. To better understand, imagine this. A Catholic priest at that time resembled an underground activist. They crossed the sea secretly from France or Spain, changed their names, disguised themselves as scholars or merchants, and moved between remote estates. Every time they celebrated Mass, every time they performed the Eucharist, they committed treason. And because of that, a room holding a chalice and a secret prayer book was as dangerous as a stockpile of gunpowder. If you ever thought the priesthood was just peaceful prayer and hymns, try placing yourself in their shoes. One winter night, you squeeze through a narrow door, curl up inside a freezing stone recess, and hold your breath for hours just to survive a search. One small mistake, a smear of ash, a Latin book left on a table, was enough to doom the entire family hiding you. Historians still debate how real the threat was. Some argue most priests only wanted to fulfill their sacred duties. Others claim the priestly network was tied to political plots, even helping stir rebellions. The truth likely lies somewhere in between faith, loyalty, and politics, woven so tightly that no one could fully separate them. If you're listening to this in the quiet of night, try to picture a young priest in a gray cloak leading a horse down a misty path. In the cloth bag slung over his back is a handwritten Missala book that, in the wrong hands, would be instant evidence of treason. Every step he takes is one step farther from safety, one step closer to the gallows. One little-known fact is that many priests were trained at colleges in Reims and Douai in France. There, they studied theology and nurtured their faith, but also learned how to change identities, read ciphers, and even how to escape. You see, they weren't just shepherds. They were people who had to become ghosts to keep the faith alive. If you're wondering why Elizabeth's court was so terrified, remember that England at the time lived under the constant fear of foreign invasion. Just a few years later, the infamous Spanish Armada would set sail. In that climate, every priest was viewed with suspicion. Did you come to save souls, they were asked, or to pave the way for the Pope? You might sigh and wonder, how could anyone be afraid of a Bible? But in those times, the authorities believed that Catholic faith was a dangerous remnant of the old order, something that, if allowed to take root again, could shake Elizabeth's throne. And so the nighttime raids began. Imagine being a homeowner back then. Every time the doorbell rang, your heart tightened. Was it a neighbor dropping by, or the guards? A trusted friend? Or someone waiting to catch you in the act? It's easy to see why Margaret Clitherow and so many like her had to choose between betraying their faith or facing a dark end. It's said that in her final hours before execution, Margaret felt no fear because of the priests she had protected. On the contrary, she believed that if she had to die, her death could prove that they were not spies. They were shepherds, teachers, witnesses to a faith that would not be easily extinguished. Maybe you're lying down, your eyelids heavy, wondering, could I have done the same? I'm not sure I could. But one thing I do believe each time this story is retold, it reminds us that faith and politics, fear and courage, are forever woven together like an ancient tapestry. And sometimes, a whispered prayer in the dark can make an entire empire tremble. You can close your eyes and try to hear the heartbeat of England under Queen Elizabeth I. It wasn't as steady as you might think. It beat fast, out of rhythm at times, pulsing with the energy of a rising empire, and at others trembling with invisible fear, the fear that religion might be the flame to burn it all down. If you've followed the story of Margaret Clitherow, you may be asking, why did Catholic faith become such a grave threat? Why would a clever queen like Elizabeth resort to violence to control the private beliefs of her subjects? To understand, we must go back to the turmoil that began under Henry VIII. Before his reign, nearly everyone in England was Catholic. The Roman Church dominated not just spiritual life, but social life too. Weddings, funerals, taxes, and education were all tied to papal authority. But then Henry VIII, for personal reasons, broke from Rome and founded the Church of England. This wasn't just a matter of renaming a religion. It tore the loyalties of millions in two. When his daughter, Mary I, took the throne, she brought Catholicism back with an iron grip. History records that under Mary, around 280 Protestants were burned alive for heresy. So when Elizabeth succeeded her, she inherited a nation weary from purges. Picture Elizabeth holding a capsized ship she had to restore order, and fast. So in 1559, she issued the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, officially re-establishing the Church of England and requiring subjects to attend national religious services. A pivotal moment was the Oath of Supremacy, an oath acknowledging the Queen as the supreme governor of the Church. From that moment on, anyone loyal to Rome was seen as a potential traitor, and if you thought skipping church was a personal matter, think again. In those days, absence from Anglican services could mean heavy fines. Refusing to attend repeatedly could even result in charges of treason. Catholic families called it the price of keeping your soul. They paid in fines, lost land rights, or as you've seen in their very lives. But pause here and consider something often overlooked. Elizabeth was not a fanatic like Mary before her. She was more pragmatic. For many years, she quietly allowed Catholics to hold private mass, as long as they didn't openly defy the state. Many historians debate whether Elizabeth truly wanted violence to escalate, or whether she was swept along by fears of assassination and pressure from her council. You see, her court was a complicated chessboard. Every new pope, every assassination plot, every naval battle with Spain tightened the crown's grip. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued a bull excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring that anyone who overthrew her acted in righteousness. That's when fear turned to paranoia. Think about it: if you ruled a small island nation, knowing that Spain, France, and the Pope all stood ready to back domestic rebellion, what would you do? Elizabeth chose absolute control even at the cost of thousands of divided families, shattered religious networks, and countless individuals forced into becoming Catholic recusants, those who refused to attend state-sanctioned services. There's a strange truth few people know. Many priests and believers maintained secret contact with Rome through clandestine handwritten letters. They used sophisticated codes, markings on envelopes, or innocent-sounding verses to pass messages. A sheet of paper with a few lines of Latin could mean a death sentence. And all those coded letters are still preserved in the Vatican archives. At this point, you might ask yourself, was religion under Elizabeth about faith, politics, or control? Modern historians still debate it endlessly. Some say Elizabeth only sought stability, and that if Catholics remained quiet, she was willing to let them be. Others argue she never truly believed Catholicism could exist without threatening her throne. Perhaps the real answer lies somewhere between those extremes. It was both ruthless politics and a fear deeply rooted in the scars of religious civil war. And perhaps that's where the story of Margaret Clitherow truly begins. As you hear this story deep into the night, remember that Margaret wasn't just a woman attending a legal mass. She was a link in a silent chain of resistance that spread across England, where tiny rooms became chapels, prayers were whispered like breath, and young priests accepted the nightmare of hanging, disembowelment, or crushing just for believing no one had the right to steal their soul. You might be wondering, how could people hate each other so bitterly over the name they used for God? But the truth is, throughout Elizabeth's reign, political power and religion were so tightly coiled together like two snakes entwining England that anyone stepping across the line was devoured. When the crowd left the execution yard, the sun was already high, casting pale light on the stones still bearing the imprint of the death that had taken place. Margaret's house, once scented with morning toast and pinewood smoke from the hearth, now stood silent as a tomb. The front door was sealed with a red ribbon, the royal wax stamp pressed into the rough wood. Everyone who passed knew what it meant. The house had been confiscated. A warning sign hung crooked on the porch, a public reminder that loyalty to Rome could end in erasure. Inside, the guards rummaged through every cupboard, every chest. Latin missals, chalices wrapped in cloth, immaculate vestments, all were confiscated as evidence of a crime. A neighbor, hiding behind a corner, watched it all unfold and later said the sound of a book cover hitting the stone floor was colder than the hammering of a coffin lid. John Clitherow, Margaret's husband, returned with his arms hanging limply. Though he was an Anglican, though he had tried to stay out of it all, he couldn't escape the pitiful stares that followed him. Margaret's children stood dazed, no one daring to cry aloud. In those early days, that family was like an empty room, no warmth left, no belief untouched. But the story didn't end there. When night fell, Catholics in York began to appear. They didn't knock, they didn't speak. They simply left a few flowers, a handwritten note, or sometimes a rosary, then vanished before the guards could patrol the street. A widowed old woman later said that for weeks, she saw candlelight flickering through the cracks in the sealed door. No one admitted to lighting it, but it never went out. Imagine that feeling, living in a city where every gesture was scrutinized, where each breath of faith could be turned into evidence of treason. And yet, in that thick air of fear, courage quietly grew. Some people were afraid. They withdrew from the faith, avoided secret masses. They whispered that Margaret had been foolish, that such loyalty wasn't worth the sorrow and ruin. But others, especially the women who had once gathered in her home, began telling their children about the Saint of York. They spoke her story as proof that even when the body is crushed beneath stone, the spirit can still rise. Years later, those stories spread beyond narrow streets, past the city gates, into whispered tales across the north of England. That story irritated the crown because instead of extinguishing the faith, they had accidentally created a symbol. Imagine it. Each night, under someone's roof, a candle still burned, lighting a small statue of the Virgin Mary, a quiet declaration that death doesn't always end everything. And from that flickering light, a new network began to form. Hidden priest holes, secret signs, and the aimless journeys of young priests resumed as if no stone had ever been placed on Margaret's chest. If you're still awake, come with me deeper into their story, those who were hunted not only for their sermons, but because their very existence threatened the fragile order Elizabeth I had so carefully built. You take a slow breath and let your imagination follow the footsteps of men in black cassocks, clutching their missals like secrets that could cost them their lives. They were not armored knights, nor violent revolutionaries. They were priests, the quiet shepherds of England's Catholic community, whose mere presence sent tremors through the crown. Picture this: a cold April night, the wind from the North Sea slipping through every crack in the door, and a young priest just arrived in Yorkshire after crossing the Channel from France. In his inner coat pocket, he carries a short letter from the Pope, a few small relics, and a scrap of paper listing the families willing to hide him. That journey was not just an act of faith, it was the greatest gamble of his life, where the reward was offering comfort to abandoned believers, and the cost could be a shameful death on the scaffold. What few remember is that, by the late 1580s, England's landscape resembled a dense web of suspicion, secrets, and surveillance. Elizabeth I's court had established a network of spies and informants unlike anything before. Every roadside inn had ears. Every parcel might be opened in search of encoded letters. There were even men who disguised themselves as priests to gather evidence against Catholic households. Historians still debate the extent of this fear. Some believe the government exaggerated the threat to justify repression. Others argue that many priests had genuine ties to plots of rebellion. But wherever the truth lies, one thing is certain: faith had become the pretext for a machinery of terror. Imagine waking each morning, uncertain whether the person you welcomed last night was a friend or an informant. Every knock on the door made your heart thunder with a single question: will they come for me today or tomorrow? And here's a strange truth: fear didn't destroy the Catholic households, it drew them closer. The more harshly the court pressed, the more ingenious these families became. Across England's countryside, priest holes began to appear, narrow wall cavities just large enough for a man to curl into, arms around his knees, breath tinged with cold stone. One historian described these priest holes as masterpieces of courage and craftsmanship. They were hidden behind fireplaces, beneath staircases, behind false panels so discreet that search parties had to tear through bricks just to uncover them. Some say Nicholas Owen, a Catholic carpenter, devoted his life to building these hiding places and died in prison rather than reveal the names of those who hired him. You might smile bitterly hearing this. In Elizabeth's reign, building a space to hide a priest sometimes took more care than constructing a kitchen. And every night, as the patrol horses echoed through the villages, families quietly opened the priest hole, and a weary priest would step out still alive. One night, in a house near the Scottish border, a child woke to the sound of a faint cough behind the wall. Later, that child would recall seeing, in the dark slit, an old priest praying. Not for himself, but for those who had risked their lives to shelter him. Pause a moment and ask yourself, if it were me, would I open the door or turn away? Many did turn away. They weren't cowards, just exhausted by the constant strain of suspicion. But some, like Margaret Clitherow, never withdrew the hand they had extended to the hunted. When word spread of Margaret's execution across the north, the psychological effect was sharply divided. Some Catholic families panicked, destroyed all their religious items, and swore never to harbor a priest again, but others began to tell her story as proof that faith could not be crushed. And that's how an ordinary woman became a symbol. Not through power or renown, but through one resolute statement: I will not plead. You're sitting in quiet, listening to this story, perhaps wondering, in the end, what is stronger, the fear of being crushed, or the peace of staying true to one's conscience? If you find yourself sleepless tonight, remember, sometimes it's these quiet stories that sow the first seeds of courage, a courage without fanfare or flags, just the silent choice to stand beside what one believes is right. And from Margaret Clitherow's sealed home, the little candles continued to burn. They lit the path for the young priests who still had miles of darkness to cross. These were the young priests returning from the continent, after years of secret study in Reims and Douai. They left the seminary in dark cassocks, a silver cross hidden beneath the fabric, and an oath so grave that even thinking of it made some tremble. If captured, if tortured, they would not betray those who sheltered them. Imagine their journey. By day, they hid in granaries, stables, or damp storage sheds. By night, they were quietly led down back roads by trusted guides, far from guard posts and villages thick with informants. At every stop, Catholic families silently opened their doors, offered a bowl of warm soup, a dry cloth, and led them down into secret cellars. There's something few people know. Many priests of that time carried coded notebooks. They didn't contain hymns, but lists of hiding places, names never to be spoken aloud. If one such notebook fell into the hands of the guards, dozens of families could lose everything. You might think their lives were only filled with fear, but strangely, It was they who brought hope to abandoned communities. In desolate corners of the countryside, where Catholics dared not show their faith, the arrival of a priest was a whisper that God still watched over them. One night, they say, a young priest named John Mush knocked at the door of an estate in Yorkshire. The lady of the house, a widow who had already lost her husband to asset forfeiture, quietly welcomed him inside. She knew that if caught, she would lose her final home. But instead of fear, she simply said, "You can rest here, Father. The wind is too cold tonight." Historians still debate the motives of those who harbored priests. Some say it was blind devotion. Others argue that for these people, faith wasn't ideology. It was the last thing left to hold on to after all else had been stripped away. Whatever the reason, they opened their doors, night after night. Picture the familiar scene in each home: candlelight flickering on a wooden table, the rustle of paper as a priest writes a letter to the seminary, and the tense breath held as guards pass outside. One mistake, one careless glance through the window, could turn the entire household into traitors. And yet, strangely, the network did not quickly fall apart. It flowed like an underground river, moving steadily through the years. When one person was taken, another stepped in. Midnight masses still took place, chalices still passed hand to hand, and prayers were spoken so softly they were barely more than breath. Ask yourself, would you dare turn your bedroom into a sanctuary? Let your child grow up in danger, all for a belief that could not be cut away? I'm not sure. Maybe you aren't either. But that's what made those years both brutal and extraordinary. There's a small story often forgotten. While Margaret Clitherow was imprisoned, Father John Mush, the very priest she once sheltered, was still hiding near York. It said he wrote a long letter to Rome describing her death. Thanks to that letter, the details of her execution survived the centuries. If he had been caught that night, Margaret's name might have been lost in time. Pause and listen to the quiet around you. In that silence, you might hear an old heartbeat, the pulse of stories that never truly disappeared, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And if you're still awake, let me take you further. Beyond the priests in hiding, there were builders of secret spaces, map makers of hidden routes, and mothers quietly teaching Latin prayers once the curtains were drawn. Close your eyes gently and let your mind slip through a cracked wooden door. On the other side, there isn't a warm sitting room, but a dim kitchen smelling of cold ash and fresh plaster. This is where secret hiding places were crafted, where faith learned how to survive in darkness. They called them priest holes. They looked nothing like sanctuaries, just narrow, sealed-off voids made of wood, or deep stone niches a few handspans wide, hidden behind fireplaces, under stairwells, or behind wardrobes. But within those suffocating spaces, an entire network of belief was held together. Picture it, a hollow just wide enough for one adult to sit hunched, spine against the wall, knees to chest, too afraid to breathe deeply. In the thick dark, there was no knowing whether dawn had come or night still lingered. Only the sound of one's own heartbeat, the footfalls of guards above, and a fragile hope that it wasn't yet the end. Few know that the most intricate priest holes were created by a carpenter named Nicholas Owen. For nearly 20 years, he traveled the English countryside, posing as a house repairman while secretly constructing remarkable hiding places. No two hideouts he built were ever alike, and he left no trace. It's said that once, he spent weeks crafting a false wall so precise that royal guards smashed at it for 3 days and still found nothing. One winter night, guards stormed an estate near Oxford. The homeowner was dragged outside for interrogation, while inside a narrow priest hole behind a chimney, a young priest and Nicholas Owen hid together. They dared not move, dared not cough. The wind slipped through the stone cracks, freezing to the bone, and some say Owen had to press his hand over the priest's mouth to keep his trembling breath silent. Later, Owen was captured and died under torture, but he never gave up a single name. Ask yourself, what makes a person willingly bury himself beneath stone floors for hours, even days? Is it faith, or simply a promise not to betray? Historians still debate this. Some claim it was near fanatical religious devotion. Others believe the severity of the crown forced Catholics to organize underground. Whatever the reason, the priest holes stand as proof that under Elizabeth's reign, faith was no longer private. It was a matter of survival. You might think this only happened in grand manors, but not so. There were small brick homes by the roadside, cramped kitchens where mothers still stirred potato soup, and beneath the packed dirt floor, a priest hole lay hidden. At night, once the children were asleep, a priest would emerge, rub ointment on his numb feet, then vanish again before dawn, One overlooked detail: priest holes weren't just hiding spots. They were storage vaults for missiles, vestments, chalices, the evidence that could doom an entire household. Some raids lasted 3 days, with guards tearing through brick and plaster, only to leave empty-handed. And that night, the homeowner would collapse on the floor, trembling as they opened the hatch and welcomed the sheltering priest back like a man returning from the dead. You might chuckle and think, at least nowadays we just hide our Wi-Fi from nosy neighbors, not an entire faith network. A small joke, perhaps, to soften the chill. But as sleep creeps in, remember this image: a pitch-dark priest hole, no wider than a wooden chest, where someone once sat still for 36 hours, clutching a rosary, lips murmuring their final prayer. And if you're still awake, let me take you further, because beyond the hiding places, there were secret courier routes, encrypted letters, and even messages encoded in something as ordinary as a tablecloth. Are you ready to open the next door? If so, take a deep breath. This story is long, and that faith hunted to the corners never quite flickered out. If priest holes were shelters, then these subtle signals were the fragile thread that kept the network intact. Imagine this: a white tablecloth draped lightly over a windowsill, a small bouquet placed upside down in a clay pot, or a curtain drawn just slightly to the left. Only those who knew the code could read the message. A white tablecloth might say, "Tonight is safe." A crooked curtain might mean, "Guards nearby, stay away." An inverted bouquet was a cry of despair: "We've been discovered." There's a story few tell. In a small brick house near the River Humber, a young mother would brush out a cloth every morning on her doorstep. The guards thought nothing of it; it looked routine. But by folding the corners in different ways, she directed a priest across 3 separate homes. If you asked whether it was bravery or recklessness, perhaps even she couldn't tell the difference. Ask yourself, how could signals so simple shake an empire? Perhaps because they proved that even surrounded by power, people would always find ways to share hope. Historians still argue over how organized these networks truly were. Some sources claim they were loose, improvised. Others insist they were so sophisticated that the routes, shelters, and codes resembled a miniature intelligence agency. Wherever the truth lies, it's clear that faith compelled hundreds of ordinary people to become couriers, protectors, and sometimes scapegoats. Picture a quiet summer night, everything seemingly at peace. In a firelit kitchen, a mother pretends to teach her child the alphabet, but the letters she traces aren't for learning. They're a cipher, a code left behind by a passing priest. Every letter, every diagonal stroke carries vital news: who has been arrested, who remains safe, and where the priest is headed next. If you close your eyes, you might hear her heartbeat pounding as the guards' horses approach the gate. One wrong mark, one suspicious glance, and everything would collapse. In truth, many families lost everything over a single slip of paper. Later, some would speak through tears. "All I wanted was to attend Mass. I didn't mean to rebel," but the crown no longer made such distinctions. To them, every sign of Catholicism was a thorn to be pulled out. You might chuckle softly and think, at least the messages I send online today won't get me interrogated. Just a small joke, to ease the weight of it all. But truly, if you've ever thought religious freedom was a given, this story will make you think again. There's a detail that always stays with me. Many of the signals were created by ordinary women, the wives of blacksmiths, mothers of children, nameless housewives. It was they who kept the faith alive, even though they never appeared in official histories. Think of it. In that overwhelming darkness, the only thing lighting their path wasn't law or crown, but a quiet belief that if they couldn't worship openly, they would find a way to ensure their faith did not die. Then, at dawn, every sign was erased. The white cloth folded and tucked into a chest, the inverted bouquet replaced with a harmless pot of yellow daisies, the curtain straightened. A house that looked like any other. But you and I know, beneath that calm exterior was an underground world held together by the courage of the nameless, and by signals smaller than a whisper. If you're still awake tonight, ask yourself, could it be that the things we call small, a corner of a cloth, a glance, a mark of chalk on a door, were the very signs that changed fate? If you ever thought the networks of refuge were just for priests and a few devout families, imagine the invisible couriers, ordinary men and women who, by day, were cobblers, cloth sellers, gatekeepers, and by night, became the bridge between scattered Catholic communities across the countryside. There was a man named Richard Topcliffe. He was no believer. On the contrary, Topcliffe was the crown's most notorious priest hunter. You could think of him as a dark shadow, a man who traveled across England hunting, interrogating, uncovering priest holes, and dismantling every code he could. People said that whenever he appeared, the air itself grew heavier, like a storm was about to break. But strangely, despite his cruelty, Topcliffe couldn't crush everything. Every time a group was destroyed, others rose to take its place. As if that faith wasn't in any one person, but a current running through every house, every heart. Picture an autumn night, wind howling across the Yorkshire fields. In a hay barn behind a manor, two men meet a young priest, just escaped a raid, and a courier. They don't shake hands. They don't share real names. They simply exchange a small slip of paper with a few symbols that, if seen by guards, would lead them both to the gallows. Historians still debate the motives of these messengers. Some say they were well paid by Catholic nobles. Others insist that most received nothing but a whispered prayer. Perhaps their reasons were as complex as the era itself, part belief, part human loyalty, part quiet resentment against a crown that had broken so many families. Here's a detail few remember. Many messages were hidden inside sewing thread spools. A scrap of paper, no larger than a fingertip, was rolled tightly, inserted into the hollow center of the spool, then wrapped again. To the eye, it was just sewing equipment. But inside was a priest's route or the names of families in danger. You smile to yourself and think, even thread can become a weapon. A gentle laugh to soften the chill in your spine when you realize that everything from a tablecloth, to a flower, to a spool of thread could save a life or doom one. That night, when the two men left the barn, they didn't look back at each other. Each vanished down a separate path, not knowing if they'd meet again. But they both understood. As long as one person remained standing, the flame would still burn. Ask yourself, what makes an ordinary person take such a risk? No rank, no promised reward, no glory, only faith and a fierce resolve to keep it from dying. If you're still awake, let me tell you one more story about the mothers who taught their children to say Latin prayers in the bedroom, even knowing one day those children might see their fathers taken away. It's said that in many Catholic homes, children were taught to recognize priests from a young age, not to report them, but to protect them. A child of 8 already understood. When father arrived, they had to run to the end of the lane and stand watch. If patrol guards appeared, the child would knock over a basket of potatoes, an excuse, a signal, a game to anyone watching, but a warning, in truth, and maybe, the smallest miracle of all. Imagine that small heart pounding inside a young chest, eyes glancing up at the adults without daring to ask, if I make a mistake, will everyone die? And yet, strangely, those very children would become the generation that kept the flame alive. They grew up with memories of whispered prayers, the chill of stone recesses, the unspoken warnings in a parent's glance. And when they were old enough, they continued to open doors, hide men, pass messages as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Some say it was Elizabeth's severity that inadvertently forged communities tighter than any law ever enacted. The more they were persecuted, the more united they became. Take a slow breath, and you'll realize you're not just listening to the stories of the brave, but to a long song about human endurance. And if your heart feels heavy tonight, remember, sometimes, a faith needs only a handful of ordinary people to hold on to it, and it will outlast every hand that tries to crush it. If you're willing to go even farther, let me lead you on. Because beyond the secret signs, the priest holes, and the nameless couriers, there were international plots, letters from Rome, and threats that hung over the Queen's head like a sword. If you've ever wondered why Elizabeth I's court was so tense, the answer wasn't just in shuttered homes and fleeing priests. It was in the dim harbors, where ships quietly anchored with more than just cargo. They carried letters, commands, and sometimes declarations of war. Picture this: a moonless night along the southern coast of England. A small vessel arrives. The sailors say nothing, only bow their heads and drag heavy wooden chests ashore. Inside isn't gold, but letters from Rome, sealed in red wax, bearing the Pope's latest decrees. In 1570, a pivotal moment in history occurred. Pope Pius V issued the infamous Bull Regnans in Excelsis, officially excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring her an illegitimate queen. That document was not just a religious statement, it was a ticking bomb beneath the English throne. Imagine the panic that swept the court. Now, any Catholic subject could be suspected as a rebel, ready to obey the Pope's call to dethrone their monarch. From that moment on, priests returning from the continent were no longer seen as preachers, but labeled foreign agents. Historians still argue over the Pope's intention. Some believe he merely meant to make a symbolic statement. Others argue it was a green light for Catholic powers in Europe to intervene. Wherever the truth lies, the effect was unmistakable. Elizabeth tightened every law. Each letter from Rome became a piece of treasonous evidence. Few realized that soon after the bull, spies from Spain and France began appearing more frequently in England. They moved under the guise of merchants, doctors, even clergy, seeking contact with discontent Catholic nobles. Rumors stirred of invasion fleets, of uprisings that would be backed from across the sea. Picture it, a rainy night, a room draped in thick tapestries, a group of men huddled over a map, whispering in 3 languages. Everyone knew that if the Queen's men burst in, the punishment wouldn't just be death, it would drag down dozens of families with it. From these whispers, suspicions spread like poisonous mold. In every parish, every lane, neighbors who once shared bread now watched each other with narrowed eyes. A widow who'd sold milk to the Clitherows for years was arrested because someone found a small image of the Virgin Mary in her kitchen. Breathe slowly and feel how thick the air had become. What was still faith? What had become treason? The line was thinner than thread, and the government no longer had the calm to tell the difference. Few realized that during this time, a secret correspondence network flourished. Letters from Rome weren't just penned on parchment. Sometimes, they were hidden inside wax figurines or written in invisible ink, only revealed when held over flame. Catholic networks learned to communicate through ordinary pleasantries, transforming a sentence like, "I send wishes for a warm autumn," into a signal for a covert meeting. One night, the guards caught a merchant transporting a barrel of Spanish wine. At the bottom of the barrel, they discovered 3 urgent letters from the Pope, promising financial support for any uprising in the north. The news was sent immediately to London. And with that, new laws were born. Searches became harsher. You might smirk bitterly. So even a barrel of wine could make a city tremble. But that wasn't all. After 1580, as the Spanish Armada began preparing for war, suspicion reached its peak. Elizabeth's government feared not only priests conducting mass, but that they might serve as guides for an invading army. Imagine that feeling. Every knock at the door at night could signal not just an arrest but the beginning of war. In that silence, who could still trust anyone? It was said that during this very time, the story of Margaret Clitherow became more haunting, because she had chosen to give her life not for political ambition, but simply because she refused to let her faith be made into a crime. If you're still awake, ask yourself, what would you do when the simplest things, a prayer, a small book, a handwritten letter, suddenly became the evidence to kill you? And if you're willing to go deeper, I'll take you to the final turn in this story, where Elizabeth's government decided that to protect the crown, it had to crush every flicker of hope, even if that hope was only a flickering candle in a mother's hands. You lean your head back, letting your breath dissolve into the dark. The story doesn't stop at secret letters and barrels hiding papal decrees. Because when Elizabeth's court realized that suspicion alone couldn't stop the river of faith, they chose something harsher, turning fear into policy and anxiety into law. If you think an empire only needs armies and taxes to survive, Elizabeth I would teach you another lesson. She knew well, what makes people most obedient isn't weapons, it's the fear of being named, fined, jailed, starved. So after 1581, the crown passed a series of laws that, by today's standards, seem almost unbelievable. The Act of Uniformity, for instance, decreed that anyone who did not attend Anglican church on Sundays would be heavily fined. If they missed too many times, their property could be seized. They could even be imprisoned without trial. Picture it, a family of 8, fined £20 per absence. That's enough to buy an entire herd of livestock. One winter alone, and they'd lose everything. And when there was nothing left to lose, only 2 choices remained: abandon the faith or disappear into the underground network. Historians still debate Elizabeth's true intent. Some say she only wanted order. Others believe she deliberately impoverished Catholics so they couldn't rise against her. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. Catholic villages slowly became isolated zones where every eye held suspicion. Picture a small village in northern Yorkshire. Each time a priest arrived to celebrate Mass, the whole community moved like a rehearsed machine. A lookout at the road's end, children stationed on stable roofs, mothers preparing vestments and communion wafers. Then, as soon as the Mass ended, every trace had to vanish in a blink. But not everything went smoothly. Some nights, guards raided unexpectedly. The sound of boots striking wood, doors bursting open, children screaming, it became a dark symphony. Those who didn't escape were dragged outside, hands trembling, uncertain what they'd lose by morning. Few mention this. Many Catholics weren't arrested for hiding priests, but for not betraying them. The law demanded they turn in their neighbors to save themselves. Imagine a freezing night, a guard shoving a lantern into your face and asking, "Did the priest come here last night? Tell the truth, and you'll be spared." Half your mind tells you to stay silent. The other whispers, "Your children will starve." You might think all Catholics were unbreakable, but the truth is far more complex. Some endured to the end, some collapsed. Some wept in the night, biting their lips as they wrote confessions, then spent the rest of their lives unable to meet their neighbor's eyes again. And in that chaos, the story of Margaret Clitherow continued to be whispered. On winter nights, mothers would gather around the hearth, sewing garments and telling their children about the woman who died beneath a heavy wooden board, so no one else would have to testify. They didn't call her a saint. They simply gave her a humble name, the one who kept the last word. Ask yourself, what makes a story spread like that? Perhaps because it gives the fragile a reason to believe that not everyone breaks. Modern historians still debate, was Margaret a fanatic or a witness? Was her silence stubborn and pointless, or the final form of resistance? Maybe the answer doesn't lie in textbooks, but in how each generation chooses to see her. One detail few know. After her death, some believers quietly considered Margaret a protector. They believed she would intercede for their courage. On the darkest nights, when soldiers came, some would whisper her name, clinging to it like the last thread of hope. Ask yourself, if you lived then, what would you choose? Betray others to save your family, or stay silent and face death? There are no easy answers, and perhaps that's why this story continues to haunt us. If your eyes sting a little tonight, know that you're not alone. Because faith, whether in the 16th century or now, is always more fragile than it seems, and far stronger than we expect. When word of Margaret Clitherow's death spread, Elizabeth's court believed they had sown enough fear to crush what remained of the Catholic community. In reports sent to London, officials wrote that the people will panic and abandon their faith. But the truth turned out differently. Rather than crumble, the survivors began to see her death as proof that anyone could become a small candle shining, even for just one night. Picture a gray afternoon, light rain misting the streets of York. In a small slate-roofed room, a few people gather around a wooden table, quietly passing around a leather-bound notebook. Inside aren't maps or coded letters, but the names of those who died for their faith. Margaret's name is written in darker ink than the rest. Someone bows their head and whispers, if she had confessed, her children would be safe, but she didn't. Pause for a moment and think about that sentence. In that era, silence itself was a form of rebellion, more raw, more piercing than any speech. After 1586, as the persecution reached its peak, the court passed even harsher laws. But the more brutal the crown became, the more it was forced to acknowledge. Even when they seized property, starved children, or crushed a mother's chest, they could not destroy the faith entirely. Modern historians look back and call this period the politicization of religious panic. Faith became not just a matter of the soul, but a tool to measure political loyalty. Those who didn't attend state services were enemies. Even private belief was grounds for suspicion. Imagine living in such a world. Every good morning could be mistaken for a secret signal. Every flickering candle accused of heresy. Every handwritten letter from France a nightmare waiting to erupt. And yet, in that darkness, Catholic communities began carefully recording the story of a woman who died for faith. They didn't call Margaret a saint, yet they copied her final words, transcribed her execution, and secretly sent the records to priests hiding on the continent. Those small bundles of paper became the seeds that would one day support her recognition as a martyr by the Vatican. One little-known detail: the first biography of Margaret Clitherow was written by Father John Mush, the priest who nearly died with her while hiding in a secret chamber. He wrote that when he finished the last page, he wept, unable to believe that such a small woman had stood against such terrible power. Picture his trembling pen against yellowing paper, the lamplight casting shadows of his thin hands across the stone wall. In that moment, he understood that people like Margaret never truly vanish. Decades passed. Elizabeth's reign ended. The Spanish Armada was defeated. Harsh laws slowly loosened. But Margaret's story kept growing like a bone of the past that refused to be buried. Some say she planted the first seed of a new idea, that faith and freedom of conscience should not belong to the crown. And slowly, from those seeds, the concept of religious tolerance began to take root, though it would take centuries to bloom. Think of it, a woman with only bare hands, an unshakable heart, and a determination not to speak a word of betrayal, yet she became a thorn in the side of an entire court. And perhaps that's when we must widen our view to see the larger canvas of Europe in that era, when the idea of religious freedom was still a distant dream. Imagine, not just in England, but across neighboring kingdoms, hundreds of thousands were hiding, changing names, changing homelands, just to keep their faith alive. In France, the Huguenots Protestants were hunted and slaughtered in brutal massacres. You may have heard of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when in just one night, tens of thousands of Huguenots were killed across Paris and major cities. The next morning, the Seine was thick with bodies drifting in silence. In Spain and Portugal, the Inquisition was a persistent nightmare. They didn't just interrogate suspected heretics, but hunted down converted Jews and Muslims, anyone not pure, in the eyes of religious authority. In damp stone chambers, hundreds were tortured for confessions, or simply because too many neighbors coveted the bounty for denunciation. Ask yourself, if Margaret Clitherow had been born in Toledo or Lisbon, would her fate have been any different? Or would she too have been crushed beneath another empire, in the name of another religion? Historians still debate this. Some argue the 16th century was dark because of blind fanaticism. Others say it was fear, political instability, and imperial ambition that turned faith into a tool of power. And when power joins hands with fear, the price is always blood. Pause for a moment to absorb that brutal paradox. Religion, born to redeem, has so often been turned into the whip that drives people into the shadows. Then ask yourself, did all these deaths mean anything? Perhaps the answer lies in the small communities where stories like Margaret's are still quietly told, where children are taught, you may never have to die for your faith, but you must understand why others once did. Son. And from those quiet sacrifices, a new idea began to sprout, the idea that humans have the right to believe, to doubt, to worship or not worship anything at all. That idea hadn't fully formed in Elizabeth's day, but it would grow through debates, through Enlightenment movements, through the first charters that protected freedom of conscience. Think about it. Without the Margaret Clitherows of the world, would we ever understand the true value of religious freedom? Or would we go on thinking it was something automatic, like air? And maybe that's why stories like hers should never be forgotten. Even if they leave us heartbroken, unsettled, or confused, they remain mirrors to our own age, a time that too easily forgets that freedom never arrives by the grace of power. If you're still awake tonight, ask yourself, if one day your faith or your right not to have one were threatened, what would you do? Would you stay silent, bow your head, or risk holding on as Margaret did? And if your answer isn't clear, don't worry. Perhaps no one knows how brave they are until the darkness descends and the soldiers' boots echo at their door. Now imagine, an autumn morning in 1685, in a small village in Languedoc, France. The Huguenots French Protestants wake to the news that the Edict of Nantes, their last shield against persecution, has been revoked by King Louis XIV. From that day, every Protestant church must shut its doors. Every pastor must leave France within 15 days. Those who refuse will face prison or execution. Picture lines of people leaving the village. Men leading pack horses carrying children. Women hiding cloth-wrapped Bibles deep in their luggage, fearing a single search could wipe out their entire family. They were called the Exiles. And for more than half a century, across Switzerland, the Netherlands, and England, you could see them stateless wanderers, clinging to faith as their only homeland. Historians still argue, did Louis XIV truly want to protect spiritual unity in France, or was he just afraid an independent Protestant community would shatter his absolute rule? The answer is as complex as any persecution, part politics, part pride, and part unspoken fear. If you know Margaret Clitherow's story, you'll recognize something strangely familiar. Though their beliefs differed, the solitude and courage they tasted were the same. Picture the first night a Huguenot set foot on English soil. In a dusty warehouse, they sleep atop flour sacks, clutching rosaries or Bibles like the last proof of their dignity. A trembling child asked his father, "Will we ever go home again?" And the father said nothing because he wasn't sure himself. There's something few people know. It was thanks to the fleeing Huguenots that many skilled trades spread across Europe, from silk weaving to printing. In hardship, they didn't just preserve their faith, but sowed seeds of craft and industry. You may have worn a fabric or held a book that traces back to the hands of these exiles, those who were never truly welcomed, but left an enduring mark. Pause for a moment and realize, no matter the decree, no matter the oppression, people will always find ways to believe and to go on. One Huguenot mother once wrote in her diary, If God is light, then even a small candle is enough to show the way. Tan. Think about that sentence. It's simple, unadorned, but strong enough to carry thousands across snowy mountains, shorelines, and borders, with their children in their arms and faith in their hearts. If you're wondering why I told this story, the reason is simple, because we easily forget that history isn't only shaped by rulers. Every step of the nameless, every quiet decision, every tear shed for a lost homeland weaves just as much into the fabric of our collective memory. Imagine being one of them. A moonless night, the sound of waves on the shore, your child asleep on your lap, and your eyes looking back toward the old continent. You know you'll never return, but you also know you cannot stay. And in that single moment when someone gives up everything to hold on to something invisible, that's when dignity shines its brightest. If you're still awake tonight, ask yourself, how lucky are we to believe, to doubt, to speak freely without fear of torture? And what would we be willing to do to protect that freedom for someone else? If you'd like to hear more, I'll tell you about the conversos of Spain, the Jews who converted, yet lit the Hanukkah candles in secret cellars, who hid Torah scrolls beneath floorboards. But tonight, close your eyes. There have been enough stories for now of ordinary people, of small flames that dared to burn when the wind had stopped breathing. I'll meet you on another night. When you're ready, I'll go on.